Okay, in this video I want to sort of talk about the process of kneading bread, but also the role that yeast play in bread. So as I've just said, they're both really important processes in bread, but they're different things. So yeast is a natural food component, and it's one of the things that we use to raise products. Kneading is a process that we use in order to change the chemical and physical properties of the bread that we're making. So they're quite different things, but we're going to look at both of them in a little bit more details, just so that you know, like when we're making products that have yeast and starch, and that we have to do the process of kneading, you understand what's going on. So I'm going to look at yeast first. So what is yeast? As I mentioned before, it's a natural food component, but it is a single cell microorganism. And why it's really important is when we give it the right conditions to grow, so that is warmth, moisture, and a food source, what happens to the yeast is it starts growing. And it's this process of growing that is actually what is really important. So we have our yeast plus moisture, warmth, and food, and that goes through a process. And the end result of the process is a gas of CO2. And this process is called fermentation. But it's this gas here, the CO2, which is little bubbles in the bread. So your bread goes from something that looks like this, just a lump of pure bread, to something that looks like this, that is full of air bubbles. Okay, and those air bubbles are the CO2. So the yeast is playing a really important role through the process of fermentation here. So just remember, when we have yeast plus our conditions, we have the process of fermentation and we get the gas of CO2. Next step in the process is we're actually going to make our bread. So when we look at the ingredients of bread, and we have a look, there'll be flour, there's usually water, there's yeast, and there's usually some salt and sugar. Okay, when we look at these ingredients, we already know that I've just spoken about that yeast is a natural food component, but when we look at flour, we know that one of the natural food components is starch, but also we also have a protein in there in the form of gluten. And we're going to talk a little bit more about this protein here called gluten. So, what is gluten? Gluten is a protein, but it doesn't exist in the flour in its dry state. Gluten is actually two proteins called glutenin and gliadin. And when these two come together and we add together to give us gluten. And it's this protein here that is really what we need to develop. So remember, our protein is a chain of amino acids. So these amino acids here make up of glutenin and gliadin in our chain, and they're really important in making bread, because when we knead our bread, it is a mechanical action. Okay, now remember, when we are working our gluten strands and we're mechanically acting, what we're actually doing is we're stretching them out through the process of denaturation. Okay, so we're making those strands much longer, like this. And then what that can do is, we already know with our yeast has created our CO2. So we've got all these bubbles of CO2 in our product. And when we have our gluten strands and we're stretching the bread through kneading, we're actually wrapping these protein strands around the air bubbles, and we're going to be trapping those air bubbles in the bread. So these new protein strands, called gluten, sort of are a little bit like an elastic band. So they wrap around the CO2 which the yeast has produced, and they act to trap that air inside. Now, one of the ways we know that we've kneaded the product enough is it becomes nice and smooth, but it becomes elastic, so that when we press our finger into the dough, it should spring back straight away. And it's that action of springing back quite quickly and straight away that shows us that the gluten has been developed enough that it can wrap around the air bubbles.